Yeah, hi, how are you? My name's Felt, and welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV. Today we're going to be talking about a non-issue issue. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, I'm going to be talking about Samurai and its kenki gauge. And why do I call it a non-issue issue? Because while the job, Samurai as a whole, is fully functional, feels just fine to play, I think its rotation feels very nice, I think the kenki gauge isn't terrible, there is a problem with it that I have that I was just going to kind of talk about and compare it to other jobs that have similar gauges and explain why I think their gauge systems have been put into a better state. And why Samurai, ever since the removal of Kaiten, which still has a place on my hotbar, by God, ever since the removal of it, I feel like the Kenki gauge has kind of lost some of its form, some of its feature, and some of what made it feel like a job gauge in place of a glorified cooldown. Let's get started. Let's start this by just talking about what the Kenki gauge is and what you can spend Kenki on. The Kenki gauge is a gauge that will build as you hit certain weapon skills in combat or use one of your OGCD buttons in Iki Shoten. To gain it through hitting weapon skills in combat, it's Hikaze, Shifu, Kasha, Jinpu, Gekko, and Yukikaze. If you hit them, they will give you Kenki for hitting them. I believe you are required to do your combos. Yes, you are. I had to double check because it's been a minute since I've actually read my weapon skill descriptions on Samurai because I just kind of play the job by feel. Apologies. But you gain 5 Kenki for Hikaze, Shifu, and Jinpu, 10 for Kasha and Gekko, and 15 for Yukikaze. Every 2 minutes, you get to hit Iki Shoten, which just gives you 50 Kenki straight up. That's how you gain Kenki. What do you spend it on? You have a handful of skills you can spend it on. Let's talk about the single target ones first. You have Hisatsu Gyoten, which is a dash in. Why do I call that a single target one? Well, you target a target. There's also Hisatsu Yaten, which, listen, I know this should be on my hotbar, but I accidentally killed myself with it like 2 times in Savage Prog, and I took it off my hotbar until I learned how to use it better. It's a backstep. It actually grants you enhanced NP, which is pretty useful. But both of those are just 10 Kenki to have a dash or to have a backstep. There is your bread and butter Hisatsu Shinten, 25 Kenki, 250 potency. It's what you do. There's also Hisatsu Senai, which is on a 2-minute cooldown, costs 25 Kenki to do a big ol' slap. There's also AoE, Kenki Spenders, and Hisatsu Guren, which is the AoE big ol' slap on a 2-minute cooldown, and Hisatsu Kyoten, which is Shinten, but AoE for 100 potency. There are 2 more ways to gain Kenki. There is Third Eye, and when you are hit by an ability while Third Eye is active, you gain 10 Kenki. There's also Meditate, which is it's a weird one. You don't use it in 99% of content, because most content doesn't just give you time when you're standing still doing a whole lot of nothing to just meditate and gain Kenki, but it does exist. So why is that a problem? I explained how the Kenki gauge works, but why do I think that that's a problem? Well, it's because 99% of the time you are hitting one singular button, Hisatsu Shinten. Hisatsu Shinten is probably your most often pushed button across the course of a fight on Samurai. It's a button that you are essentially hitting off of cooldown at 35 Kenki gauge. You hit 35 gauge, you may as well hit Shinten unless you are trying to build up a tiny bit of extra gauge for the 2-minute window. Why do I say a tiny bit of extra gauge? Because you kind of need to hit Iki Shoten before you enter your 2-minute window right now because of Oginamakiri. You need to activate Iki Shoten to make Oginamakiri be ready, and because of how you have to have casts during your burst window because of EI Jutsus, you only have singular weave windows for part of your burst window. Meaning that you kind of want to hit Iki Shoten a little bit early to make sure that you're not having to mess up your weaves and slam Iki Shoten the second before you need to hit Oginamakiri and potentially club terribly and cause all sorts of problems for yourself. Much easier is to hit Iki Shoten a little bit early, meaning that your Kenki gauge isn't even something that you build going into 2-minute windows. You only build a 50 gauge, and then you hit Iki Shoten, and all of a sudden you're full now. It's a gauge that doesn't really get a ton of usage because of that, because of this button instantly filling your gauge by halfway, and it makes it so that Hisatsu Senai isn't something you need to save gauge for anymore. Hisatsu Senai used to cost 50 gauge in the past, meaning that Iki Shoten did immediately give you Senai, but you had no other buttons to push at the time, meaning that you really wanted to save up Kenki otherwise. Senai only costing 25 now, means that since it costs the same as Shinten, it's not really hard to save up for it. You just kind of be like, okay, well, I save up an extra 25, maybe, if I want to delay Iki Shoten a second and hit Senai earlier. But the gauge doesn't really do much. It's mostly a glorified Shinten button, and with Iki Shoten giving you an instant 50 gauge of the 2-minute burst, it makes it so that the only other button you might have to save up for in Sanai doesn't really need to be saved up for, because you get double the amount you need to cast it, in place of the amount you need to cast it. It used to be better, because it used to have Hisatsu Kaiten, and Hisatsu Kaiten is a relic of a bygone era that I refuse to take off my hotbar, because I'm weird like that. But it used to increase the potency of your next weapon skill by 50%, meaning that you would use it before your Ie Jutsus, before your Ogi no Makiri, and it would boost their potency by a good chunk. You don't do that anymore. You don't need to do that anymore, so Samurai Burst Windows is now hit buttons, spam Shinten if you haven't hit Sanai yet. Or if you have hit Sanai, sorry, I misspoke. If you've hit Sanai, you just spam Shinten through the rest of your Kenki gauge during your burst window. It's one button. Every weave window, Shinten, unless you have the Shoha proc. It makes the gauge feel like it's very much just a glorified cooldown button for Shinten. It doesn't feel very interesting. It doesn't feel like you have to think about how you save your gauge up. You just hold 10 gauge at all times if you ever think you're going to need to backstep or dash in. And the rest of the time, you're just kind of spamming on that Shinten. Let's compare the Kenki gauge with Ninja's Ninki gauge. It works in a very similar way. You land these GCDs and you get Ninki. You get 5, 5, 15, or 15. So it's very similar. 20 every 3 GCDs. Bahavakakra is the main button you will push it on. It is a 50 cost, though, in place of a 25 cost, so it does happen a little less often. Hellfrog Medium is the AoE version. You also have Bunshin, which is another 50 cost one. That is only 90-second cooldown, which is something you need to keep track of a little better. Like Iki Shoten for Samurai, you do have Mug on Ninja, which does give you an extra chunk of Ninki, gives you an extra 50. And you also have Meisui. Now, I have to explain a tiny bit of how Ninja works, but the bottom line is you use Tenchi Gen, and you have an extra proc of Suiton at the end of your Tenchi Gen, which you use Meisui on, to get you 50 extra Ninki and a bonus damage version of Bahavakakra. That's the bottom line. That's the really quick and dirty version of it. Why do I think this is like a slightly better than Samurai's Kenki gauge problem? Why do I not have this complaint about Ninja? Well, it is longer build up for a slightly larger hit. Ninja also has Trick Attack. And I don't mean like Trick Attack, the 2-minute burst button. I mean actual skill named Trick Attack. A 1-minute cooldown that every 60 seconds gives you 10% bonus damage. Samurai's personal buff is something that is up all the time, so you never need to plan around saving stuff for a burst window on the odd minutes. You just kind of spend. Ninja has Trick Attack, meaning that you kind of want to save up extra Ninki going into your Trick Attack so that you can spend Bahavakakra on it. Or spend the Ninki on Bahavakakra. Misspoke, apologies. You also have Bunshin on a 90-second cooldown. And Bunshin is a button that is very important to hit off cooldown, because otherwise it will slowly drift and lose usages and fall outside of party buffs when it does line up with the rest of the party buffs. And because of that, you now need to have 2 cognizant thoughts in the back of your head as you're playing Ninja. Am I saving enough Ninki up for my odd-minute bursts as well as my 2-minute bursts? Am I saving enough Ninki to use Bunshin off cooldown? You have 2 different thought processes going on in the back. Samurai is, do I have 10 for my dash? No? Alright, save. Yes? Hit Shinten. There's a lot less to Samurais right now compared to Ninjas, where you have a little bit more going into it. Now, don't get me wrong, Ninja does have the same similar problem that Samurai has. Iki Shoten just being a haha 50 gauge. Mug is also similar in a haha it's 50 gauge. But because Ninja has a little more to keep track of as a whole with its gauge, with building it up for that burst window in general, with making sure you're saving enough for your Bunshin, I find that Ninja handles the gauge a little better than Samurai does, and I'd hope that in the future Samurai's gauge moves to something slightly similar to the way that Ninjas operate. Please don't make it exactly the same, though. We're already way too similar on 2-minute burst windows. That's the video. This one's just a little short. It's just kind of like voicing my opinion on how Samurai currently stands in regards to its Kenki gauge, comparing it to a job that has another very similar gauge, and why I think that job operates a little better in its gauge management than Samurai does, and kind of putting out there into the void of the internet, so to speak, that hopefully Samurai gets some slight changes to its gauge. I don't think it's in a terrible spot. I think Samurai as a job flows very smoothly right now. I really like the way that its rotation works, and I hope that the job's core identity doesn't change from what it is right now. But I do hope the Kenki gauge gets some slight changes. The Kenki gauge really feels like you just hit Shinten off cooldown a lot of the time, as long as you have 10 gauge saved for a dash. And that's not the most exciting thing compared to pooling resources for 2-minute burst windows. Either way, hope you enjoyed watching the video. If you agree with me or disagree with me, like, dislike, comment, all that stuff. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this on the channel, and I hope to catch you in the next one.